Hello, and welcome to Exploring Practical Christianity. This is a podcast from Erskine Parish Church. My name is Reverend David Nicholson, and this is our first ever video episode. This podcast is there to help you make sense of your faith as much on a Tuesday morning as perhaps we like to on a Sunday morning. It is to help people with very practical questions that they have in terms of understanding their faith, but also living it out and putting it into practice. And so this third episode where we're looking at quite a lot of questions that people have when they're at the start, but even after many years of their discipleship journey. And what I want to focus on today is, how do you know what God wants you to do? What's your purpose? What's your calling in life? That's a question that lots of people ask. That's not limited to people of faith or people exploring faith. And it's a very human question to ask, what is the point in what I do, or what am I wasting my time maybe doing one thing when I should be doing another? Now, not all of these questions are possible for me to answer today, but I wanted to combine the answer to this question with some Bible teaching as well, because in the church recently we've been going through the book of Nehemiah, and so much of what I like to preach ends up on the effective cutting room floor. Basically, there isn't enough room for it in the final cut of the sermon. And this was one of those instances, because on the first chapter of Nehemiah, when I opened the sermon series, we very much focused on prayer and on Nehemiah as a model for prayer. But something Nehemiah is also a model of is calling, and how you can know that. So in the following, there's going to be broad principles that we're going to look at that anybody can put into practice, such as things like that often what you feel burdened about, that can point to your calling in life. The role of planning and preparation in terms of following your sense of call, the gifts that God gives us in His grace in order to enable us to fulfill whatever it is we want to do. And ultimately, what should guide everyone in looking to find their purpose is that, particularly for people of faith, that God would be glorified and other people would be helped, as well as obviously finding some satisfaction along the way. But probably to do all of that, it's worth doing a quick crash course in the book of Nehemiah and the character of Nehemiah, so we can sketch out exactly how this plays out, this opening chapter, and the role of calling and purpose within it. So Nehemiah is one of the books in the Old Testament where it's describing the historical situation of the people of God once they had been exiled from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, all through the Old Testament, is a place, but it's also an idea. It has enormous significance in terms of being a religious center, a civic center, but it's also the centerpiece of a lot of the prophecies and promises that God makes about how and where He's going to dwell and be in their midst. So what ended up happening was the people had settled their country, and they had their religion and their administration all up and running, and they began to kind of stray away from God, and then the promises of the covenant kicked in, and they have places that are surrounding them, enemies and foreign empires that come in, invade them, ransack the place, and deport and carry them off to a faraway land. And Nehemiah happens, so that all happens around 586 BC, and then Nehemiah happens around 100 years after that, when the original Babylonian Empire is overtaken by the Persian Empire, and the Persian Emperor is a lot more relaxed about letting people go home and rebuild their society. And Nehemiah is the story of one of the waves of those returning kind of exiles who get to try and have a go at rebuilding their society, their nation. And it's a really big metaphor about how people rebuild their sense of belonging and the people that they are, that God has promised that they would be. So that's kind of crash course and why we land on Nehemiah. It's a crisis though, because as Nehemiah hears about what's going on and how badly the destruction has taken effect in Jerusalem, the extent and state of the ruin that the city is in, it is working on that, on the physical, practical level, but it's working on the spiritual level as well. And Nehemiah, if you like, is giving you an insight into the fact that the people were kind of spiritually devastated and destroyed, as well as their city being in ruins. So these two things are always in interplay. So let's look at, if you like, the first thing that we see about finding your purpose and calling, taking into account Nehemiah's context and situation. And your context and situation will be different, but it's about trying to apply these principles as we go along. So the first one is the immense power of a burden. Now, I know that sounds like a bit of an oxymoron. Who amongst us likes a burden, likes having something heavy to carry, likes feeling the weight of something burdening you? But a burden can be a pretty holy and even redemptive thing. Let's look at the first chapter. First chapter, chapter 4. When Nehemiah hears about the state of the destruction of his city and all its significance for them being the people of God, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So this is a really common motif all through the Old and the New Testament of people when they hear devastating news about the welfare of the people of God, that they mourn and they fast. But the implication is that this perhaps isn't bothering anybody as much as it's bothering Nehemiah. We certainly don't learn about that anyway, and we certainly don't get anybody that responds in the very positive and decisive way, the way Nehemiah does. Now, he mourns and fasts for a number of days at this juncture, but in another part, when we get to chapter 2, we find out this period of him praying, weighing up this burden that he feels for the city and the people of God. That takes about 4 months. And so it seems to be fairly particular to him the way this affects him, and thus his response is kind of particular to him. There's not other people that are stepping into the gap that he does. It actually puts him into despair. But here's the practical application for us, that often the point at which you feel weighed down and burdened, that can often be an indicator of the calling for your life and for my life. It might not always be a burden. Sometimes it can just be an intense point of passion that we see a need and we desperately feel the void of that need, that it needs to be met, whether that's to pick a very low-hanging fruit example, is if we feel there have been plenty of people that have seen the plight of, whether it's people in poverty or destitute or in our culture and food poverty, and they dedicate their life to going and working in that because they feel that need so personally that it sparks something of their heart's desire, but also that sense of purpose, that's kind of what they move toward. And that is different for all of us because we can't all be called to meet all of the needs everywhere. And what I loved about this story was just how it made that news finally fell into the heart of somebody who was poised to really feel it and to really sit with the weight of it, and they responded it. Within church, this is really practical. I always say to people quite often come to me and say, I really feel that kind of thing needs done. And my response will quite often be, yeah, well, it sounds like you'd be great for it, because sometimes we are able to see things that others can't. We are able to feel things about what needs done that others can't. And that's usually a really good sign of a meeting point between that burden or need that we're feeling and something that we should be involved in. So sometimes our calling can come through that burden and need weighing on us, and God allowing that to be the first step. But secondly, the role of planning and preparation in any calling, that verse where we read that he fasted and prayed for days, and then we've learned that it becomes months. That's because sometimes the calling that's been placed on us, the purpose, the thing that we're made to really move towards, it's for not now. It's something that is future orientated. It's something that there's still some pieces that need to line up. Everything isn't quite right or ready for us to move into that. And this is one of the most basic principles of Christian living we've been thinking about so much, is praying and waiting on God is one of our meat and drink to us. It is so basic, it's so necessary, but it's something that we can quite often fail to grasp and acknowledge the significance of. And this is something that I struggle with too, because I am action orientated, and I can be impulsive, and I'm more likely, if I think something's a great idea or I feel called to it, to charge into it. And something I've been reflecting on recently is something that I need to grow and learn more of, is that praying and waiting and seeing what is right, and seeing, if I was to pray and wait on something, whether the blocks would land in place a bit more and my calling would be a bit clearer. Because calling is quite often something that doesn't, or purpose in life isn't something that appears all at once either. But even just that, praying and asking God to show us what's next, what's the next move, or how long should I stay silent, or what do I do with this burden, that praying, and even giving us time, if it involves perhaps a change in role or career or speaking to some people, that gives us time and it allows us to wisely prepare for it. Jesus has that great phrase about the fact that nobody goes off into war without first counting the cost. There's a kind of very common sense and sensible approach to whatever it is we might feel God is calling us to putting in the planning and the preparation. And then there's the gifts of grace. So we've got the sense of burden and need impressing on us, the planning and preparation, but then the fact that God will give us whatever gifts we need for our calling and purpose. And this is one that's all too easily overlooked, because we find out in Nehemiah's story, I'm moving forward to chapter 2, but in verse 5, he basically negotiates with the Persian king and emperor, can I go and sort this out, because I think I'm the man for the job. And he says to the king in verse 5, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my ancestors' grave, so that I may rebuild it. And the rest of the story of Nehemiah is just this working out and unfolding how he manages, as basically what's a brilliant project manager, to go ahead and to, with skill, instruct and manage and order the rebuilding of the city, which was a really complex practical task as much as it was spiritually and mentally demanding. And so we see from that, and this is one of these ones where God's hands off in the background of the book, that God has placed in him everything that he needs to do the job. And so God doesn't actually call us to anything that we don't have within us, or indeed that he won't supply. But very often, some people have the dramatic experience of being called and having that sense of call or purpose to move into something that they don't have what it takes, but God, like, fairly miraculously supplies everything they need. I think often more times than not, it's a case of we discover those things had either been hidden in us or well known to us. And this idea of, this is what I'm going to apply this to everyone, this idea of calling and vocation, it's not just for the church, it's not just for special projects in the history of the people of God, and it's not just in Christian missionary work or serving. I grew up with a kind of culture, and I think a lot of people in church do as well, that the most sacred and special thing you can do if you want to live your real purpose and serve and live for God in this world, and there's nothing higher or more glorious or holy than either going into full-time ministry or working in as a Christian or church outreach worker, or indeed as some kind of missionary. But that's not accurate at all, because we see Nehemiah lives his calling in rebuilding the temple, but so do lots of other people with their skills of craftsmanship. In the Old Testament, when the tabernacle was being built, which was the sort of mobile tent that the children of Israel used to move around in the wilderness, we see that God's Spirit gave people all kinds of artisanal and practical crafts and gifts in terms of being good with woodwork and metalwork and fabrics and embroidery. We believe in a God who loves the creation and who scatters his gifts all throughout the creation. And so it's actually quite wrong to say that, some people have ministry type gifts and they're more special than the ordinary gifts that people have to be good administrators and accountants and butchers and bakers and care workers and teachers and firemen and doctors and lawyers and admin assistants, and I'm pulling them out at random, so I'm going to run out here. But replace that with whatever it is that maybe you did a long career and you felt like you weren't ever sure if it was what God wanted you to do, or you weren't sure if it was God's purpose for you, because we have always in the church given this idea that things aren't as holy unless they're ministry, and it's just wrong. Anybody who does any kind of job well is glorifying God, because it's kind of something doing what they were designed and made for. It's something we managed to a wee bit recover at the Reformation. The German monk and reformer Martin Luther was really big on this idea that the way a baker honors God is by baking the best bread that they possibly can, and doing that well. The Apostle Paul says, and where you eat or drink, whatever you do, in all things, do it to the glory of God. And that's an important thing for people to remember, that God has given us all a great diversity of abilities and gifts and skills within us. And often our calling or our purpose is us using those things He's already giving us as well as we possibly can. And it really is as diverse as many jobs as there are out there. That's the amount of gifts that God can give people, and that's the amount of purposes and calling. Because a way I used to knock this down was when people would sometimes argue that ministry is just that much more special. Well, in the world that we work in a ministry today, for one crude example would be, not many people walk to do their ministry work. They kind of rely on a car. But most ministers that I know, and I'm one of them, aren't very good at fixing cars. I can do the absolute basics, but I can't do anything very complex. So I need other people to be called to that in order that I can do the ministry that I do. But that still assumes that my ministry might be more important than what other people do in terms of the care and the love that they show in the world, and it just isn't at all. So there's great diversity, and calling often, purpose often overlaps with the good things that God's already put in us and the gifts He's given us to make the world a better place. Which brings us to the last one, that if we have seen the power of a burden and a need that we feel, if we've put some time into the praying, planning, and preparation, we have acknowledged that it often overlaps with the gifts that God's given us already, rather than looking for brand new ones. Lastly, that all of this can be done to the glory of God, first and foremost, but also in order to help and enable other people live a flourishing and more meaningful life. And I love the way Nehemiah prays to God in verse 8. He says, remember the word. That this is when he's kind of bargaining with God. Why is the city in ruins? Like, this needs sorted. He says, remember the word that Moses, you commanded Moses your servant, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are under the farthest skies, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I have chosen to establish my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great power and your strong hand. Nehemiah is really not just living for himself. He is here reminding God that God promised to have His name worshipped and glorified in this kind of central place by His people that He'd bound Himself to. And he's saying, God, remember that and take it seriously. Nehemiah is actually expressing that it's his deep desire that God will have that worship and that glory once again by his own people that He's called, being in the place where He's called them to, and in their, if you like, in their place of promise. But He also wants that for His people and for the name of His ancestors. That keeps getting mentioned because His sense of identity and belonging to a people is precious. He's got a communal view of life, and it really is not for Him just live for His own individual benefit. And I think this might be, I don't know if it's the most important point, but I think it has to weave through all the other ones, that our calling, especially if we have any claim on the Christian faith and to belong to God, it has to serve well, it has to be glorifying to God. So that maybe knocks out certain callings and professions, but it also has to have the good of others in mind. And there are so many ways to do that. Obviously, somebody who works as an electrician and they're brilliant at that, they are making people's lives better all the time. Then I suppose it's a question of ethically how they carry it out and what they charge and so on. But by definition, there are so many different kinds of callings that can make other people's lives good. And as we said in the last point, we can glorify God when we're doing that to the best of our possible abilities. But what this kind of excludes and knocks out as a very broad category is maybe not so much individual callings, but a way of going about purpose and calling that is mostly about ourselves, whether it's our own betterment or just for our own financial enrichment. Or certainly this would be a massive red flag for any kind of callings or industries or roles that trample over other people and by definition make other people's lives worse or are exploitative, because the great golden rule that runs through the whole of the Bible is that we are here to love God but also to love others and serve them as much as ourselves, to think of them as at least as important as ourselves. And so it's difficult because in our culture today there is a lot of propensity that pushes us towards kind of trying to take care of ourselves first. I mean, self-care is good, but it has to be held in balance and proportion with our lives within some kind of community. And so calling should always, in whatever way, and it'll look different for different people, it should be honoring to God at the very least, and it should in some way seek to benefit and stand to benefit other people as a result of us doing it well. So that's Nehemiah chapter 1. That's a different angle from what I preached. If you want to look at the sermon I preached about Nehemiah's prayer and his approach to prayer, that is available on all our channels on Spotify and YouTube. But my intention was that this would be helpful for people anywhere really who are wanting some kind of biblical rubric of what does it look like to know what God wants you to do? What does it look like when somebody kind of figures that out? What process do they go through? And that doesn't need to be for Christian or full-time ministry or anything in the Christian world. That can be, a calling and a purpose. It can change over time in life too, because all these principles can be applicable not just when we're starting out and either trying to find our career, perhaps when we're trying to change career, but they can be applicable even in retirement. Like, what do I do with my retirement that is glorifying to God and helps others? And also that has that thing of I see the need and the gap. And it's something that when I pray about it, I feel like I'm moving further towards it. These are for all of life, and they are for wherever, not only the stage we find ourselves in life, but indeed the circumstances we find ourselves in life. We have been made by God for God, to give him glory and to enjoy that and to use the gifts that he's given us, and it pleases him when we're able to do that. So I hope this is helpful to you. Get in touch. You can get in touch in the comments or indeed drop me an email at epcminister@gmail.com or epcnotices@gmail.com. Let us know how you get on with the content and feel free to get in touch with other things you'd like to see. Bye bye.